Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to Alliance webinar. Today's topic and webinar will be related to the Alliant PDF Accessibility Index, insights, analysis, and action items. We look forward to a robust conversation and interacting and presenting some interesting information for you. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. All participants are muted upon entry. You may turn on live captions by selecting the captions button at the bottom of the screen. Use the Q&A feature for questions. Some questions may be answered live. We're trying to save some time at the end to address Q&A as well. And an on-demand accessible recording will be shared with all who registered once it's available. Just give us a day or two to get it captioned and prepared for distribution. So, welcome. Today's speakers, my name is Dan Sullivan. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer with Alliant. I've been with the organization for about 5 years and spent probably the last 10 to 12 years working in the accessibility space, helping organizations meet their accessibility requirements. Joining me today is Amy Waldorf, our Partnership Manager. More importantly, she has been an individual that has worked very closely with a number of our state and municipal government clients, particularly in the state of Colorado over the last couple of years. For those of you who are aware and those of you who aren't, Colorado actually put together and implemented some accessibility requirements that very closely mirror the rulemaking that was put in place by the Department of Justice. And Amy spent an entire year traversing around the four corners of Colorado, speaking to municipal government leaders that were looking to implement accessibility programs. She's seen the future, and she has some interesting perspectives to share based on how both municipal, state, and other entities have been addressing these requirements related to accessibility, particularly when it relates to document accessibility. So today's agenda, we'll start out with a very brief overview about Alliant. We'll provide an overview as to the PDF Accessibility Index, what it is, why it was done. I really want to start the conversation out with a little bit of oversight as to why accessibility matters, and then get into the trends and the insights, specifically the guts, if you will, of the Accessibility Index itself. And then once we sort of help define and lay a benchmark in place relative to what we found and what we see in the marketplace, provide, and this is where Amy's really going to be able to help, drawing on some of her experience working with a number of customers across government and other sectors in the last few years, really the insight to action, right? Now that we're able to define what the issue is, how do we move forward and put our organization on a path to meet the requirements and to present information that ultimately is as accessible as it needs to be in the market? And then lastly, we'll have a quick Q&A. So with that, just a quick brief overview as to who Alliant is. Alliant is essentially the merging of three organizations that have specifically focused on providing accessibility solutions and offerings in the marketplace for literally the last almost nearly 30 years. T-Based Communications, which is an organization that specializes in providing alternative format communications, braille, large print, things of that nature. We work with many banks, telecommunication companies, government entities, and being able to provide any documents that are required to be sent to or interacted with individuals that need them in alternative formats, whether that's braille, large print, audio, etc. Common Look, which is an entity that's been in the marketplace for nearly 25 years now, which is really the foremost authority in PDF accessibility, providing both software and remediation services to address document accessibility for organizations that need to present both PDF and other types of documents in a means that's accessible. And then the third group within our umbrella, if you will, is Accessible 360, which is an organization that specifically focuses on digital audit and helping organizations make their digital interfaces, websites, mobile apps, et cetera, fully accessible for those individuals that use them. So the idea and the concept here is that regardless of how you communicate, interact with either constituents, customers, or members of the public, we essentially have a mechanism and a means by which to help you with all means of those communications and making them fully conformant with the guidelines, as well as accessible for those individuals that need to consume them in formats that are maybe different than a standard digital interface. So the idea and the concept here is really designed to be an end-to-end accessibility solution provider. It really puts us in a unique position to talk about the research that we've done and talk a little bit about the work that we've done assessing the marketplace specifically related to PDF. So this brings us to the point of the conversation and the sort of the meat of what we want to get into, which is the PDF accessibility index. And the concept and the idea of this was really to create and present the market's first ever large scale cross industry analysis of the state of public facing PDF accessibility. I would say, in my time in this space over the last 10 plus years, probably in the last 12 to 18 months, there's been more of a focus on document and PDF accessibility than any period of time that I've been in the space. And a lot of that has to do with the rulemaking, both for Department of Justice's Title II rulemaking, as well as the rulemaking by HHS for healthcare entities, that is really designed to make certain that all the content that you present externally is fully accessible for those individuals who need it. And the idea and the concept of this is that we really wanted to be able to help define the size and the scale of the issue and the topic, and really provide a benchmark for organizations to see, where in the marketplace are PDFs that are in the market relative to accessibility. And then when you start to look at where you stand and where you're trying to get to, really understand how you benchmark across the industry. And the idea and the concept here is, sort of a quote from our CEO, the PDF accessibility index gives the market something it has never had before, a true baseline, right? Organizations have the insight they need to benchmark their own efforts against industry standards and leverage this data to influence organizational change. So the one thing, we've heard from a lot of customers is, all right, I'm not in a great place, but where am I relative to where I should be? Where am I relative to my peers? Where am I relative to the market? And that's really the reason why we went through this exhaustive process of accumulating data across a wide swath of industries, sectors, and websites to accumulate the data and really begin to develop that benchmark. So as we sort of get into that, we'll talk about the PDF accessibility index and really specifically speak to the methodology of how we put this together. So what you will see is we scanned about 774 websites across a number of key industry segments. Those segments were education, government, healthcare. Then we had another bucket, which were really regulated industries like financial services, insurance, legal compliance, and utilities. These tend to be the areas that not only fall under the rulemaking, but have large, significant inventories, if you will, of PDF documents that they present to the marketplace that have requirements to meet the accessibility guidelines that have been put forth by the Department of Justice or exist within Section 508 or in the HHS rulemaking. So when we did all of this work, we essentially analyzed 644,854 individual PDFs. Those PDFs averaged about 32 and a half pages per document. And this index essentially accumulated the information that we found in over 15 million total pages of PDF. So I think as we dig into this in a little bit more detail, I think it becomes important that we kind of lay out the specific definitions around what we saw and what we report on. And I think the definitions are important to understand because, there are different sort of phrases or terms that get used relative to accessibility and usability and compliance requirements. And I think, there's basically 4 different criteria or categories that we speak to in the index that we wanted to make certain that you understand what it is that we're saying when we use these terms. So the first one is the term accessible, and that's a PDF that passes all automated checkpoints, no warnings, no failings, no issues identified. These are the types of documents that we have traditionally been turning back to our customers when they want our services applied so that you have a fully and completely accessible document that meets 100% conformance against the guidelines that you're specifically remediating those documents to. The second category that we use is usable. And really, this includes all of the documents that are accessible, but these are the ones that passed all of the automated checkpoints, but may actually have some specific issues that pop up that are more warning level issues. What we tend to find is that the average screen reader user, an individual that needs an accessible document, can usually navigate and consume the majority of that. But by the strictest definition of accessible versus usable, this really falls into the category of usable. And then there's a third categorization, which we refer to as inaccessible. And this is a PDF that has no structure, no accessibility checkpoints pass. They failed at least one of the accessibility issues, and we would essentially deem this PDF to be inaccessible, and a screen reader user that was trying to access it would as well. And then the fourth category that we talk about a little bit is something called tagged. And tagged is something that's uniquely different to PDF as opposed to digital or other things in the accessibility space, which are elements that get introduced into a document that essentially build an initial structure. And what we like to essentially say is the concept of tagging a document is the foundation for an accessible document. A tagged document is not necessarily a usable or an accessible document, but it's the foundation that you would pour in order to build that document in a manner that could be either user or accessible. So we identify documents that are just purely tagged, and we found documents that are just tagged, but frankly speaking, there's no additional work that was put into them to make them either usable or accessible. So those are the definitions. I think before we dig in, I think far too often in the conversations that we've been having over the last year and a half to 2 years with municipal, state government, Title II entities, healthcare entities, is everybody wants to know, what do I got to do and how do I do it? And I think for the purposes of this conversation, and frankly speaking, any conversation we have, is we like to stop the music a little bit and say, before we get into the what and the how, we should probably talk a little bit about the why. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about why PDF accessibility matters, particularly in government and healthcare settings, and how inaccessible content can really impede a sizable portion of the community and marketplace's ability to secure the services, to gain the information that anyone else ordinarily could consume. And I think one of the examples that I like to use, and I hate to pick on the poor state of Montana, but our vice president of accessibility, Aaron Page, happens to live in Missoula and does a lot of work in and around the state of Montana. This is an example of a PDF document that we found. This happens to exist within the Secretary of State's office within the state of Montana, which ironically enough is a polling place accessibility complaint form. This is a document that if you have an accessibility barrier or a complaint relative to a voting process that you went through and you wanted to file that complaint, the concept is you can go to the Secretary of State's office, get a copy of this form, fill it out, complete it, and submit it. The problem with this, as great as it is that we have a conduit by which to register a complaint about an accessibility barrier at a polling location, is this is a scanned image. There's no way that someone can interact with it. A screen reader interacting with it just will essentially read out that it's a scanned image. None of the information gets conveyed. And the only way an individual, particularly an individual that this is designed for, which is someone with a disability, would have to print a copy of this out and fill it out and then ultimately either mail it in or bring it directly to the Secretary of State's office. Suffice it to say, an individual couldn't independently navigate this document, complete this document, or submit this document. And the only way that you could do this is actually rely on somebody to assist you through that process. This experience is wholly and completely inaccessible. Not lost on me the irony that this is an accessibility complaint form. So the question would be, well, what can you do? Well, we took a copy of this document and we essentially remediated this document or converted into a document that was fully and completely accessible and interactive with a screen reader or any other means by which you need to use assistive technology to navigate through the document. Not only do all of these fields announce themselves and explain the structure of the document, we also made it into a fillable form so that you can actually live using your computer enter your name and all of the other information that's required in here, and you can actually save a copy of this form and you can submit it electronically. The bottom line is the difference between an accessible experience and an inaccessible experience can be just as simple as making a document fully accessible and interactive in the way that it needs to be done. So before we got into it, I think too often a lot of folks that we've been speaking to are trying to solve this issue and trying to do what they need to do, but they don't fundamentally understand the difference. And, the one thing that we probably didn't have the time to do, and we have some great recordings on our webinar library that you can pick up and you can view, is we've done some screen reader demos that will actually show you the difference between accessing the document to the left and documenting the document to the right. And if you are trying to make the case within your organization why this is important and why it needs to be done, I strongly recommend that you sort of pull down that particular webinar in our archive and just watch and hear, as we like to refer to, AP Aaron Page, who's our Vice President of Accessibility. He navigates these two documents into two uniquely different experiences. And I like to say it's ear-opening, because you actually hear how an individual navigates through this document. You really begin to understand why it's important that all constituents and all individuals within an organization can access information consistently. So why don't we move forward now into trends and insights and get into the specifics of the index? As I say, I like to sort of speak to the why before we get into the what and the how. So at a very high level, all of that 15 million plus pages of PDFs that we analyzed and we scanned and we looked at, we found that about 94.75% of those fail accessibility in some way. When we spoke about the criteria of usable, the good news is that we found about 5.25% of those documents are usable, meaning that they've made some effort to make the document accessible, but they still fail some accessibility checkpoints. I think the dark cloud and is juxtaposed to the silver lining is that only literally 1/3 of 1% are considered fully accessible. So, the bottom line is, I think one of the reasons why the Department of Justice really decided to put together rulemaking that laid out the criteria of what needs to be done is PDF accessibility is failing at scale, right? And it's across the entire market. There's no one out there, there's no industry that we looked at, we'll get into some of the specifics, that are doing an exceptionally good job. But there's a sizable and significant portion of the population that are just prevented from being able to gain access to information and content that others are able to. And the concept of the rulemaking is to really level the field and just make certain that all people, regardless of ability, have the equal ability to access and consume information. So, a couple of the industries that we broke down. The first one that we would talk about would be education. And when we looked at education, we really broke it up into 4 different buckets. We looked at private colleges, public colleges, large K through 12, meaning large municipal entities, large cities, and then mid-sized K through 12. So these tend to be smaller public education entities. We looked at over 100,000 PDFs, consistent with the numbers that we saw. About 98+% fail accessibility, and about only just less than 2% contain warnings and really are considered to be usable. The interesting thing about this is Title IV and Title II and some of the requirements related to accessibility have always lived within the realm of education, and that's principally about making content to students accessible. But this is the kind of information that's generally available on a website that you could come to, and it's not specifically intended for students that may require accessible content. So, education in particular was an area that we found was significantly below the mean and what we found on average. A couple of things when we dig into this in a little bit more detail, taking a look at public colleges, private colleges, large and mid-size. Interestingly enough, the smaller the educator from a size perspective, the worse the accessibility was. And I think one of the things that we've definitely learned from spending a lot of time in this marketplace and speaking to a lot of folks is this often becomes not only a matter of means and budgetary ability to address this as an issue, but it also speaks to the large number of authors that may exist within an organization. And what we tend to find is the smaller the government entity or the smaller the school district is, one of the big ways that a lot of the folks that work within these organizations communicate with the public is to create documents, convert them into PDFs, and publish them online. We've spoken to county governments and municipal governments that literally have hundreds, in some cases, thousands of authors that are creating PDFs and have the rights to publish them to public domains. So, I think one of the challenges that we find in education and government not only is the high percentage of inaccessible documents, but it's the authors that are not equipped with the tools, the resources, or even the knowledge to create accessible documents. So, in education, I think, one of the things that we recognize and understand, this is a highly regulated industry. Obviously, EEOC, a whole folks of other organizations take a look at. Department of Civil Rights are always looking at education issues related to accessibility. But I think, it comes down to a matter of the size of the authoring community as well as the means that organizations have. And we definitely found that education is falling behind. So we'll move quickly into the next segment, which is government. Within government, essentially, we broke government down into a number of different segments, which we'll report on in the next slide. One is U.S. federal agencies. Remember that Section 508 has been sort of the law and the rule with federal government agencies now for the best part of 20 years, which require them to make both digital and document interfaces accessible. State governments, we looked at all 50 Secretary of State's websites. County governments, small, mid, and large size municipalities. And we really wanted to look at each municipality in a different segment of size, because we recognize A, number of authors, but B, the amount of resources that are available budgetarily to address this as a topic change based on the size of the organization. As you will see, government very much within sort of the realm of what we saw across the entire index. About 97+% of PDFs fail accessibility. Just under 3% are what we would consider to be usable. And we know that a lot of organizations are working on this. There are a lot of organizations in the marketplace, particularly with the DOJ rulemaking, that actually have the ability to segregate their publicly available PDFs and archive a number of them. And we know that there's a number of state municipal entities that are going through that process and they haven't gotten there yet. And we know that when they do begin to archive some of their inaccessible PDFs that don't fall under the Title II requirements, this number should change. But as we saw it when we did this information late in the fourth quarter and early in the first quarter, this is the data as we found it. So when we break government down a little bit more granularly, as I said before, the U.S. federal marketplace has had Section 508 as the law of the land relative to accessibility for the best part of 20 plus years. And if you take into account that the federal government has had a 20-year head start on getting their documents accessible, and they're only at 94.5%, they're at 94.5% inaccessible. It could be argued that the federal government didn't do a particularly good job with a 20-year head start on the rest of the marketplace. But as we went down through that scale, we started to see that as we got into smaller and mid-sized municipalities, the overwhelming majority, and for small municipalities, almost all of the PDFs that we found failed accessibility. So we know that this is a huge issue. I think one of the things that I think is helpful as we go through this, particularly if you're working at a mid-size or a small municipal government or a county government, and we're able to assess where you stand, as you make the case for what you need to do, this gives you at least a little bit of a benchmark to compare yourself against. And if someone feels as though that you're not moving fast enough, or where are we relative to the market, this data starts to give you a little bit of context as to where you stand. We're all trying to move the ball forward on this, and it's helpful to understand where we all started from. And when it comes to government, obviously we have a pretty long path to go to address those markets. Again, indexing a lot of the inaccessible PDFs that don't need to be made publicly available will be a fantastic way to really change these numbers dramatically. And when we redo this index again for next year, because our intention is to do this on an annual basis to measure the progress that we're making, we suspect the government sector really has the biggest opportunity to significantly change as a result of being able to archive data that frankly doesn't need to be out there in its inaccessible format. So moving forward to healthcare, this is one of the areas where I think that we see a glimmer of hope and sort of tells us that we think that the HHS and DOJ rulemaking is probably going to make a significant impact. In this area, we broke healthcare out into three separate subsectors, if you will: federal Medicare and Medicaid recipients, I think, or entities or organizations that have customers that are on Medicare and Medicaid. Why that particular sector is particularly important is, of all the marketplaces that we've been working with in the last 10 to 15 years, the one area and the one market sector that has really put a lot of emphasis and a lot of focus on making particularly PDFs accessible are Medicaid and Medicare participants. They are guided by Section 508. They're required to meet the requirements of Section 508. And we know that there's been a lot of investment into that space. We also took a look at private healthcare entities, hospitals, things of that nature, to take a look at across the board. We looked at about 70,000 PDFs. The good news here is that we saw a significant move forward in it, but upwards of 22% of these PDFs were usable. And we think that has a lot to do with the fact that the regulations and the enforcement of the regulations in this particular sector have been more significant over the last 15 to 20 years. So the idea and the thought process here is that the DOJ and HHS rulemaking starts to be really rolled out and implemented across these market segments, that we really do believe that these types of regulations will start to make more of the content that's available publicly accessible. So when we take a look at, the breakout here, as good as we've been finding on the federal side of it, Medicare and Medicaid participants, we've also found that in the private healthcare sector, there hasn't been as big of a focus on accessible PDFs as there has been in the federal space, and it looks a lot more like our education and government sectors. So I'll move through this real quickly. Obviously we have a good benchmark, and it'll be interesting to see. But healthcare in particular tends to index a little bit higher. So those are the main sectors that we walk through in a little bit of the data. And at the end of this presentation, we'll share a QR code with you, and anybody that wants a copy of the index can get a copy of it so that you can take a look at that and really be able to dig into the data a little bit more granularly on the vertical that you're in. But the silver lining that we find in this is that those industries that have been spending time and really working to make their documents accessible over the last number of years, we see a significantly higher percentage of those documents. As a matter of fact, healthcare's usability rate is 27 times higher than the aggregate that we found in the government category, which really leads us to believe that with a focus on this and with some intention to make the content accessible, that we can get there. Now, I'm not here to argue that the percentages that we're seeing in healthcare are anything to celebrate against, and that upwards of 3/4 of PDFs are still considered to be inaccessible, but the ball does move in the right direction. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amy. I think the first portion of this is to review the data and saw what we have in the benchmark, which I guess kind of defines the issue. But, before everybody sort of this tends to be an anxiety driven process. It's like, all right, being able to define the problem is the easy part. Where do I start? How do I get going? And I think that's where turning this over to Amy, and she's going to speak about really moving from insights to action and how we can really move the needle. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy and we'll walk through.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks so much. So, before we get into kind of, okay, what do I do? What's my first step? Tactically, where do I begin? I think it's important to take a step back. And Dan and I have kind of a good cop, bad cop thing going on here because Dan delivers our findings, and it is not lost on me that we have a virtual room full of accessibility leaders right now that ostensibly care about the accessibility of the documents at their organization, and are actively working to make those documents more accessible. So I don't want to discount the work that's been done. But at the same time, it's clear that across the market, we're failing. Most documents remain inaccessible. So what can we do about that? I have spent the last 2 years personally sitting down with hundreds and hundreds of accessibility leaders, primarily in the government space. I've sat down with them in their offices, on Zoom, in town halls, at coffee shops. I've met them at the dog park. So I have had the opportunity to kind of hear this problem told to me over and over again. And what's interesting is what I usually hear is the same story. So I want to validate the fact that this is a really difficult problem to solve, and the numbers really reveal that. This is a problem that is complex and it requires a lot of different components and understanding. So, where do we begin there? Most organizations I work with dive straight into, okay, I need to get accessibility done. So let me find someone, and this person is voluntold that they own accessibility now. And here's my tool set. I'm going to purchase the tool that makes the most sense for my organization, and we're going to hit the road, and that's going to be the plan. Unfortunately, that falls short in a couple of different ways. So before we get into how do we pick tools and all of those kind of tactical steps, we really want to take a step back and look at two things. So the first is we want to understand the documents that we have. I know that we're sitting here, we're telling you essentially 95% of documents in the market are completely unusable for anyone who is blind or low vision. The goal is not necessarily to get to 100%, though, because we need to have an understanding of the documents that we do have and be able to say which documents are out of date and should be archived versus which documents are most important to my users, which documents are most frequently accessed, and then also which documents are simple and I could use an automated solution to remediate those documents, and which are complex. Think about fillable forms, maybe some of your more complex maps, things like that, that I need to have manually remediated, or even in some cases, create an alternative format for. So we're not necessarily saying every document that's on the internet right now needs to be made accessible, but each document needs consideration about what is its journey and what makes sense for that document. So that's the first piece. The second piece we really want to consider here is driving cultural buy-in. And this is a big component of why accessibility programs fail at scale. As I was first working with customers in the government space, the first step they take, like I said, was often picking a tool, picking your champions, and training those champions on the tool. And that's kind of where we all began. And then I started hearing the same question over and over again and the same feedback, which is I can't get my leadership to buy into this program. I can't get my higher ups at my organization to remediate their documents. And that really speaks to the cultural issue and this paradigm shift that needs to happen. So as Dan mentioned, most organizations have hundreds, if not thousands, of authors of their documents. And so we need to have a paradigm shift where we all start to recognize the fact that we are all working in accessibility now. If you're creating a document, you own a piece of that accessibility responsibility for your organization. And that's not easy to do. Most of our authors already have multiple jobs and kind of multiple job descriptions and tasks on their plate. They've got a lot to juggle. They're certainly not just sitting around waiting to remediate a document. And we understand that, but that is still it's critical for driving a successful accessibility program. So, in terms of some steps there, it's really important to tie your accessibility program into the culture of your organization. So, if you have a culture of public recognition, recognize people who are doing a really good job with their accessibility in their document space. If you have a culture of, sharing swag or little gifts, tie that in some way. And then it's really important to, of course, utilize your champion network and make sure that everyone has the right training. But your champion network isn't going to be able to get this done alone. So it's important to tie KPIs both to individuals and to the organization so that people have goals that they're reaching towards that are tied directly to accessibility. And building in a QA program to make sure that as you are posting new things to the site, those things are in fact accessible. So those are all kind of the steps you want to take before even necessarily getting into or before thinking about what are the tools I want to buy, how am I going to get this done tactically, like Dan mentioned, the how and the what. So that's something I always start with that consideration is how am I going to make sure that whatever tools and investments I make, they are the right tools and investments because I have prepared my organization to move forward. So from here, at that point, when we have that buy-in and we've given that cultural consideration, what are our tactical steps? What do we do next? So the first thing we want to do is get an inventory of our existing PDFs. So there are scanning tools that exist. Alliant has one. There are others in the market as well that can scan your documents and give you an understanding of what exists on your website and how accessible it is. Based on the findings here, it's a pretty safe bet that most of those documents are going to be inaccessible unless you have a really mature accessibility program. But it's important to know what documents do I have. And not only what documents do I have, how am I going to prioritize the remediation of those documents? So which of these are out of date and under the rules of Title II, or maybe just kind of by common sense, can be either removed from the site or archived rather than remediated. So we want to really think about how we're prioritizing the remediation work because frankly, there's going to be a lot of remediation work to be done. Most organizations have a backlog that runs years and includes thousands of documents. So the first thing you want to do is address those most important documents for your organization. I think about forms and things that are transactional, documents that are frequently accessed. But I had a conversation yesterday that was really interesting where we were talking about the importance of emergency documentation. If you're a government entity, I live here in Colorado, we have a lot of documents out there about evacuations in the case of wildfires. And you hope that that is not your most frequently accessed document, but in the moment that it's needed emergently, and there's no time to make a request for that document. So kind of considering which of these documents matters most and where do I want to begin in my remediation process, and also the right technology solutions to make sure that I'm getting that project done. So this is going to, like I said, involve a understanding of the documents that you're working with. So if you have fillable forms, those need to be manually remediated. I am not aware of a single automated tool on the market that is going to have efficacy against your fillable forms. But if you have simple brochures about the summer activities in your town this summer, that can probably be done with an automated solution that's going to save you money. So kind of balancing balancing where you are adding effort. And then, of course, the software that you are providing to your team internally to be able to remediate documents and create documents accessibly moving forward. Creating an organization-wide policy is going to be critical here. It's not enough to get the tools and train your team and tell them that this is now a part of their job. We need to have structure and policy around this to ensure that there is governance and we are able to maintain the implementation of these practices. And then next bullet, Dan. There we go. And then lastly, like I mentioned, we want to enforce that organizational accountability. So tie this to KPIs, tie it to organization-wide plans and goals. Make sure that you have a long-term strategy that is really built for longevity and sustainability. It's a much better investment to do this a little bit slower and do it the right way than try to kind of put the cart in front of the horse, get this done and not make a plan that is going to have a lot of longevity. If you get all of your documents remediated that are on your site today by a vendor, that's fantastic. But if you don't have a plan in place for your future documents that haven't been created yet, you're going to find yourself in this same position again. So we really want to avoid that by making a long-term plan, creating a policy, and finding ways to enforce that policy. So, in terms of how to kind of build this sustainable approach, how do we want to make sure that we are building a plan that has a lot of longevity? We think about this in basically three buckets. So, the first bucket here is true up. This is where we are going to want to scope the problem. We want to understand what documents we have, where do they live, which are important, which need that manual remediation, which can be done with automated remediation. So this is kind of just getting inventory and taking an honest look at the documents that exist and deciding what needs to be archived and what needs to be remediated and what does that path forward look like. The next step here is going to be catch up. So this is where you are going to want to catch up on your backlog of documents. It's difficult, I know, and I know that it's an overwhelming problem for a lot of organizations, especially as you think about, wow, there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pages of PDF on my site. How am I going to handle this workload while also thinking about the future? This catch-up piece is essentially looking at that backlog and figuring out what is our plan to address the backlog here. Many roads lead to the mountaintop. I have worked with organizations who have started working through this backlog using software and their internal teams. I've worked with organizations that have sent all of their documents in for remediation and they have outsourced all of that work. A lot of organizations find that they need to balance their budget and their bandwidth, and so they use some blend of the two. And that's often what is kind of the best approach there. And then lastly, we want to think about keeping up. So as we look to the future and how are we going to be creating documents in the future? Like I said, you can send all of your documents in for remediation today, but that does not change the fact that you are going to create a new document tomorrow and next week and the following week. And so we want to make sure that we have a plan moving forward to ensure our documents accessibility into the future. So this is where it's really important to set up the right relationships with vendors to either provide your internal teams with software that's going to allow them to author documents accessibly, remediate new PDFs, and also, potentially to continue having contracts to send documents out for remediation to your vendors so that you have that long-term strategy in place. You've budgeted for it and you know that accessibility is a part of your organization moving forward. And then lastly here, just ending on a quote from our Chief Technology Officer, Mr. Faraz El-Reyes. The most important takeaway from this report is that the problem is solvable. Our goal for this index is to serve as a catalyst for change, helping organizations understand where they stand today, prioritize the most impactful improvements, and build more sustainable practices for tomorrow. So I love that we're ending on this note because this truly is a solvable issue. There are solutions out there. I have worked with a lot of organizations. I've worked with points of contact and government employees who have had meltdowns breakdowns and cried in front of me and told me they'd rather quit their job. This is too overwhelming. But I've also worked with a lot of organizations that I've gotten to watch those same people turn into really mature accessibility leaders that are building really strong accessibility problems. So I've seen it done. There are practiced ways to do it. And that's it's a solvable problem. So I hope that's what you take away from this. So that is kind of our takeaway on the PDF Accessibility Index, our first iteration of this index here, and the first kind of true look at the market and where PDFs stand across the board. We'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions I wanted to start with, Nicole in the chat answered one of the first questions, but I think it's probably one of the more important ones, and I did want to read it to make certain everybody was aware of it. Which Sarah asked, "Will you be making the results of the index public, kind of like the WebAIM index?" First of all, love the reference to the WebAIM index. What we really endeavored to do with this is really provide the PDF version of the WebAIM index for websites. We want really this index to be the same benchmark for PDF. So thank you for invoking that, because maybe potentially we're actually achieving what we're trying to do. We have PDF versions of it available. We're actually putting it into an HTML version that will be available. We will be sharing a QR code, and you can come to our website and download a copy of it, and get a copy of the index. The idea and the intent of this is for us to refresh this data on an annualized basis, very similar to what the WebAIM index does, so that we can see if we're making some progress. I would tell you that the initial findings that we found with this index were not wildly different than what we saw when the first WebAIM digital index went out. And I think one of the things that we've been challenged about is we've kind of, on the digital side, been sort of treading water, and we haven't really moved forward in the same way. But moving forward, we want to be able to provide that index. So appreciate the first question. A couple of the others that are important, right? What do you consider an accessible document? Are you able to change which standard use test documents against for accessibility? So, Lynn, the short answer to your question is absolutely. So we have a tool that's a free downloadable version that you can download. It's called the Common Look PDF Validator tool. It actually gives you a number of different standards that you can test the document against. I would tell you that for here, and you make some references to some of the Canadian standards, which are available, and some of the ISO standards, which are available. There's also an HHS Section 508, WCAG standards. All of those are available in the tools. Frankly speaking, there are other testing tools that are in the marketplace that give you the ability to test against those standards as well. It is important to note, at least for the Title II requirements and things of that nature, it's really the WCAG 2.1 standard that's really being measured and looked at. So from that perspective, you can test against anything. There's a question that's asked by Shruti, and Shruti, I really do appreciate your question, and it's one of those questions that could be a rabbit hole, and we could take easily all of the time that is left. There's a couple of different approaches for addressing signature fields in PDF. I will tell you that if you look at the grand scheme of PDF accessibility, signature fields are usually like the last mile. I think we'd be happy to schedule some time with you and go over what some of those options are. But I want to make certain that I get to as many of these as we can get to. Another question we have, and I think this is very common to the types of questions we've been receiving over the last couple of years, and it's from Scott. He says, our company hosts hundreds of small newspaper websites. We have archived many thousands of newspaper e-edition PDFs. Individual websites can have hundreds of e-editions in the live database, plus publishers upload all kinds of PDFs from governments, right? We also host many fillable forms. Basically, he has concerns that this is just such an overwhelming issue, and he has risk associated with it, that he's not going to be able to meet the DOJ deadlines. This is the very common response that we get, to which I try and essentially articulate to everybody is, this is a progress over perfection issue, right? This is a journey that you need to go through, and it's a fairly large lift. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not dispensing legal advice, and I don't want anybody to think as though that we are. But I think what's as important as anything else is that you acknowledge that this is an issue you need to address, you build a plan, and you get on the road to moving towards where you need to be, and that you're starting to implement some of the easier and initial parts of that plan. I think that's really what is as important. I wouldn't be as focused of, I need to have every conceivable PDF and every digital element that exists in any inventory or any run that I would to make certain that it's 100% accessible so that I've eliminated all of the risk. I think the key is you need to be able to demonstrate that you're making progress and that you have a plan and that you articulate that plan. And there are numerous ways and numerous technologies that can essentially get you, we're working in multi-phased approaches with some of our customers where using some of the automated tagging and automated remediation tools that are out there to at least deliver a certain portion of usability and efficacy into PDFs, and then work on those more prioritized documents to make them fully compliant. So I would say, Scott, this is the most common sort of phrase question that we've gotten, and I think it's super super important that we went over that. And I think don't focus on the end destination, focus on the journey and getting on the road towards doing that. And in the state of Colorado with HB 21, which look very similar to what's going on with the Title II requirements, one of the things that one of the requirements in there is that you have a plan and you update that plan on a quarterly basis and you publish it to your website. And frankly speaking, many of these organizations are given grace if they're able to at least articulate and demonstrate that they have a plan and they're getting there. This is a big problem that's been created in some cases for some government entities over 20 or 30 years of just creating and stockpiling inaccessible documents. The expectation that it's all going to be fixed in a 12-month period of time, both from a budgetary and from a human capacity perspective, is unrealistic. But I think the key is that we need to be able to demonstrate that we're moving in the right direction. Some of these I'm just reading on the fly. 2 questions from Ray. Are there tools for remediation that are usable by those that use screen reading technology? So yes, there are many elements that actually exist within the Common Look PDF tool in certain segments that we have, which are fully accessible and usable by individuals that rely upon and use screen readers. As a matter of fact, our vice president of accessibility has worked on creating some of the VPATs for that. But I will tell you, it's relatively rare, and it is a challenge based on the way that those tools work. But Ray, there are tools, and we'd be happy to show them to you. And frankly speaking, might make sense for us to schedule you for some time with Aaron Page, who's our vice president of accessibility, who is fully blind and uses a screen reader, and he'll be able to demonstrate how he uses accessibility tools for doing that. The second thing you said, are there AI tools which can either help you evaluate the accessibility of your documents or remediate them? And the answer to that question, quite frankly, is yes. However, the one thing I think that's really important to understand is that none of these tools fully get you to where you need to be. They can be assistive in that process. I will tell you that whenever there's a big issue like this, I would say that digital accessibility really exploded on the scene about 12 to 15 years ago. And then there was this emergence of these tools that sort of put themselves forward as sort of a magic wand. Just apply this line of script or code into your infrastructure and voila, your entire website is fully compliant. 2 things problematic with that. One is they're not. 2, you essentially put a gigantic target on your back that you're basically trying to take a shortcut, and you actually increase your risk as opposed to mitigate it. We have some tools and some automated remediation resources which can substantially make your documents more accessible as an initial step. As I spoke about with the question previously from Scott, this is one of those first things that you can do. You might be able to work with an organization like Alliance or some of the other organizations that may be out there to use some of these tools to drive an increase in the efficacy of your documents while you work towards evaluating the balance of them so that you can demonstrate this incremental approach. I will tell you, just like we saw in the digital space, there are some new offerings that are coming on the market that will tell you, oh, it's really simple. We can do this in seconds. We're just going to give you a differentiated view. You don't even have to make the document accessible. We just show it in a different way. Couple of things. One, that runs a write of code that's very easy to see. Secondly, these organizations are essentially communicating or articulating that you're presenting accessible PDFs. You're not. If the subscription ends, if their host server goes out, those documents are not accessible. If you download the PDF and send it to somebody else, it's not accessible. I will tell you, beware of, there's an old adage in life that continues to remain true all the way through 2026. And if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And I think what we found with some of the overlay players in the marketplace that were promising amazing results that ultimately didn't get delivered, we're starting to see similar promises being made by accessibility providers relative to PDF. The good news about working with an organization like Alliant, we've been at this for 25 years and we kind of know where those are. What percentage of success criteria are you able to test? Frankly, with PDF, one of the really nice things about that is we're able to essentially give you full and complete reporting on all of the success criteria within a document. PDFs are a little bit different than website domains, which tend to be much more faceted, dynamic, and moving. So, Lynn, to answer your question, when you get a report through the validator tool, it will give you a full assessment of every element that exists within that document. Let me just see, based on time, we've got a few more minutes. Any other questions we have? In our organization, Federal, we have a significant push in history of using PDFs and PowerPoint. We have moved away from that to move towards HTML-based delivery. However, the feedback we get is this does not fit into 508, but is based on what appears to be faulty ability to meet PDF 508 accessibility standards. How do we help people who have lived in PDF to understand how that is different in HTML? Great question, David. And I think it also speaks to the concept of authoring, right? So to be able to build and do something in HTML requires certain accesses to different tools and resources and different ways to display that content versus the ability to create a PowerPoint or a PDF. And the way in which people there's a huge push. And I think, the one thing that people have tried to say is, I've been reading for, I guess, the best part of 20 years that the PDF is one day going to disappear and it's no longer going to be, it's not going to be a viable resource. But one thing we found is the total number of PDFs that are available on the internet go up year over year. They don't decline. So I know there's a big push to move in this direction. But remember, developing stuff in HTML has accessibility requirements on it that are very similar to what you need to do relative to PDF. So it doesn't really take that away. Lynn asked a question, what do you think about publishing EPUBs instead of PDFs? Again, PDF, one of the big benefits of EPUBs is that it has certain elements to accessibility which are better, and we think that it's a great trend to go in. The problem is the availability of that, the industries that utilize it, being able to distribute this in some cases to hundreds or thousands of authors becomes really difficult. But if you're an institution where you can implement like something like that, it is a great step in the right direction.
I see,
Go ahead.
and I see that Trudy asked another question here. She said, could you share some tips for building accountability in a large, complex organization? Shruti, I think there's a lot of ways to do this based on kind of how your organization operates. I would recommend thinking about having goals both at the individual contributor level, at the middle management level, at the executive level, and then your overall organization that are tied into your accessibility plan. And then building out structure to be able to review documents that are new to your website and documents that are maybe about to hit your website, kind of building in an added layer of QA there before documents go live. That's going to kind of allow you to track the success of this. And then I also would say you've got to take it all the way back to the why. If you find that it's not successful, I think it's really important to use those screen reader demos that Dan was talking about earlier. Make sure that you're really making this feel human for everyone involved.
And Rachel, you ask a great question. And I covered it very briefly at the top based on the capabilities of some of our businesses that we have. But your question is screen readers are most commonly referenced, but what tools do blind readers use for physical papers? Do we need to do something for mailed letters, et cetera, to make certain that they are accessible for scanning apps, et cetera? So great point, and it's certainly one of the things that we do. A significant portion of the work that we do on a monthly basis for a number of our customers is actually convert or transcribe communications and documents into alternative format for communication, whether it's bills, letters. We do a lot of work for the Library of Congress, being able to convert books, magazines, newspapers, et cetera, into what we refer to as alternative formats, known more generically as Braille, large print, or audio communications. So if you have specific users or specific constituents that need documents in an alternative format and they're not able to utilize or leverage a screen reader, remember screen readers are relatively complex software applications that take a long time to learn. Many people lose their sight much later in life and need to use other alternative means by which to consume that information. There are mechanisms and ways in which we can assist in getting that converted into formats that those users ultimately can consume. Amy, do you see any other questions that I didn't touch on?
The only other thing I would mention maybe is I don't know if I'm going to mispronounce your name, but it looks like Baracco writing in from Italy asking about the accessibility in Europe and kind of raising awareness about the importance of PDF accessibility. I think there's a lot of advice that can be used. I think the first thing is to start with the why and make sure that they understand what the experience for a screen reader user is. But also, I would love to chat with you about accessibility in Europe and kind of where things stand right now, because they're following a very similar wave that we are here.
Yeah, and to follow on that, Bracco, I think one of the things that's interesting with the EAA and some of the requirements in Europe is we're really kind of seeing in Europe right now what the United States went through 10 or 12 years ago when digital accessibility really became very prominent. I think what the initial focus is by everybody right out of the out of the gate is to take a look at their digital infrastructures, their websites, their mobile apps, and it oftentimes sort of making documents or PDFs accessible have largely been considered to be sort of the last mile of an accessibility program. I think that some of the things that we're experiencing here in the United States with some of the rulemaking is PDF is now part of the entire journey because what we're finding is many of those organizations haven't really meaningfully done anything in their digital environments. So if we're kind of sort of taking a look at the last, if past is prologue, if you will, where in the European Union, we're starting to see really what the marketplace looked like in 2013, 2012 in the United States. I think that a lot of the initial focus in the European Union is going to be largely on digital infrastructure, but ultimately you're going to see folks will begin to turn to and look at PDFs. We've had a number of European customers that have been looking at it as part of a holistic approach. But if I were to guess based on your question, it'll really start to come in focus when people feel as though that they've got their arms around their digital and their web infrastructures. All right. With that, I think we got to most of the questions. Shruti, as I said, your question is probably it would take me about 16 seconds to read, but it would probably take me about 16 minutes to answer. But we're more than happy to have a separate conversation with you and dig into you on that one. The good news about that is, if you can make everything else fully accessible within a document, there's different ways that you can cite using alt text or other means for a signature line. There are some paths to get into it, but there's a lot there. So with that, just wanted to make certain that we enabled everybody to gain access to the index, download it. We will be making an HTML version of that available for everybody to get, but there's a QR code that's on the screen now. But if you come to the Alliant website, you'll also find the path to download a copy of the index. It gets into the granular data. I think the important thing that we want to make certain that everybody understands is that this will be consistently reviewed on an annualized basis. We actually have some intentions to do some sort of subsequent releases on this through the course of the year. Just like citing and speaking to the fact that we're seeing that there was pretty decent movement within Medicare and Medicaid providers that have had Section 508 for a number of years. One of the things that we want to do is go in and take a look at specific jurisdictions that have been ahead of the curve on accessibility, like the state of Colorado with HB 21-1110, like the state of California with AB 434 for state agencies, where they've had requirements in place to make documents accessible. What we really want to begin to do is start doing some very specific assessments and scans of those areas to take a look at where they benchmark and compare them against the national benchmark to determine, hey, is the effort that's being put forth in this, is it making a difference? So there's a lot more that will come out from this, and we'll be building on this on an annualized basis. But we feel as though this is the first version of the book, but we'll have a few more epilogues as we go and a few additional releases of information. And on an annualized basis, generally around the beginning of the year, it's our intention to release a revised annual review, very similar to the WebAIM digital assessment, which was referenced earlier in the presentation. And then for those of you that want to get your hands on some tools or some resources, this is a QR code, and on our website, you can find access to some of the software tools that we make available that you can utilize to address some of your PDF accessibility requirements. We have a free 7-day trial that's available that you can sign up for, and we'll automatically distribute a copy of that software to you, along with some training, an oversight, and some overview on how to utilize that and put that to play. And you can utilize that and determine, hey, is this something that actually helps sort of some of the documents accessible, and is this something that we might want to deploy within our organization? As I said before, so much of the focus by many of the organizations we spoke to are around how do I get caught up. Not a lot of people have been putting focus into how do I make certain that once I do get caught up that I'm creating new accessible documents on a go forward basis, because to spend all that time filling in the hole that the last 20 years have created doesn't really help anybody if you've got a thousand other authors around the organization that are digging other holes. So with that, we want to thank you for your time. We want to thank you for the questions. Our information is here. Amy's email address, my email address. We'd be happy to schedule a time. Anybody that wants a free assessment of your domain to get a cataloging of all of those PDFs that are out there, like Amy talked about on the True Up, we'll be more than happy to do that for you. We'll be able to give you a comprehensive assessment of where you stand, and then by all means, we're more than happy to sit down with you and come up with a plan which enables you to demonstrate that you are on the road to where you need to go to, that makes your organization defensible by having a plan that's realistic and maybe incremental. And we can help you develop that plan and put it into place so that you can mitigate risk as much as possible. As I say, don't look at this as an overwhelming problem that you can never do and not get started. I think the key is getting started. And I think being able to demonstrate that you understand it and that you're on the road is as meaningful as being at the end destination. So with that, we want to thank you. We appreciate everybody's time. And if anybody has any additional questions, by all means, reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to schedule some time and review with you any questions you may have. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.